There's something about driving through the mountains of Appalachia that gets under your skin. The way the fog clings to those ancient peaks like it's hiding secrets. The way small towns appear suddenly around hairpin turns, looking like they've been frozen in time for decades. Most folks pass through these places without giving them a second thought, but some towns have a way of making sure you remember them, whether you want to or not. Today, we're diving deep into 5 remote Appalachian settlements where visitors arrive with every intention of leaving, but somehow never manage to find their way back out. These aren't your typical ghost towns or abandoned mining camps. These are places where people still live, still work, still go about their daily routines. The difference is what happens to outsiders who wander in unprepared. Before we venture into these forgotten corners of America, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you're going to want to stay tuned for what we uncover in these shadowy hollows, especially if you've ever felt that spine-tingling sensation that you're being watched from just beyond the tree line. The Appalachian Mountains are among the oldest on Earth, formed over 480 million years ago. They've witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, absorbed the blood of wars, and buried secrets that most people aren't meant to discover. In certain isolated valleys and hidden coves, the boundary between our world and something else seems to wear thin. These 5 towns represent places where that boundary has worn so thin that crossing it becomes disturbingly easy. First on our list is Millfield, West Virginia, population 127 according to the last official census, though locals insist that number hasn't changed in over 40 years. Not because people don't die or move away, but because others always seem to take their place. The town sits in a valley so deep that cell phone service cuts out completely about 3 miles before you reach the main street. GPS systems start acting erratic around the same distance, often showing impossible routes or directing drivers in circles. What makes Millfield particularly unsettling is how normal it appears at first glance. There's a general store, a small diner, a post office, and a handful of houses scattered along the winding road. The residents are friendly enough, always eager to strike up conversations with visitors. They'll ask where you're from, where you're headed, and most importantly, whether anyone knows you're here. It's that last question that should set off alarm bells. Multiple travelers have reported the same strange experience in Millfield. They arrive planning to stay for an hour or two, maybe grab a bite at the diner or browse the general store, but somehow hours slip by without notice. Conversations with locals become increasingly surreal, filled with references to events that supposedly happened decades ago, as if they occurred yesterday. The townspeople discuss relatives and neighbors, using names that appear on weathered gravestones in the local cemetery, graves dating back to the 1800s. Sarah Martinez, a travel blogger who visited Millfield in 2019, documented her experience in disturbing detail. She arrived at noon planning to photograph the town's historic buildings for her blog. According to her camera's timestamp, she took her first photo at 12:17 p.m. Her next photo, apparently taken just minutes later, was stamped 8:43 p.m. She had no memory of the intervening 8 hours. Her blog post, published weeks later, described feeling like she'd been in a dream where the same conversations repeated endlessly, where the same people walked the same routes over and over, and where the sun never seemed to move in the sky. More troubling are the reports from families who've gone searching for missing relatives last seen in Millfield. Local law enforcement claims to have no record of such visitors, despite multiple witness accounts of their presence. The townspeople are always helpful, offering detailed descriptions of the missing persons and even providing information about where they might have gone. But these leads invariably end at the town limits, where all traces simply vanish. The most chilling detail about Millfield is discovered by those who manage to leave and later research the town's history. Census records show the same family names appearing generation after generation, but with disturbing inconsistencies. Birth dates that don't align with death dates. Marriage records between people who supposedly died decades before meeting. Most unsettling are the old photographs in the town's historical society, images dating back to the early 1900s, showing faces that visitors swear they recognize from their recent interactions with current residents. Our second location is Hollow Creek, North Carolina, nestled in a valley where three mountain ridges converge. The town appears on some maps, but not others, and its location seems to shift depending on which route you take to find it. Locals in surrounding areas speak of Hollow Creek in hushed tones, if they speak of it at all. Most claim never to have heard of it, even when pressed about the road signs that clearly point in its direction. What makes Hollow Creek particularly dangerous is its reputation as a place where time moves differently. Visitors consistently report watches stopping or running backward, digital clocks displaying impossible times, and most disturbing of all, the sensation that they're experiencing the same moments repeatedly. The town's main street is lined with shops and businesses that seem to operate on their own mysterious schedule. A restaurant might be bustling with customers at 10 a.m., completely empty by 10:15, then full again by 10:30, with what appears to be the same exact crowd. The residents of Hollow Creek have an unsettling habit of finishing visitors' sentences, not in a friendly way, but as if they've had the same conversation countless times before. They'll reference events from the visitor's past that they couldn't possibly know about, or make casual mentions of future plans that the visitor hasn't yet made. Multiple people have reported being greeted by name by strangers who insist they've met before, despite the visitor being certain it's their first time in the area. Dr. James Wright, a physicist from Duke University, visited Hollow Creek in 2020 while researching temporal anomalies reported in the Appalachian region. He arrived with sophisticated equipment designed to measure electromagnetic fields and gravitational variations. His instruments immediately began registering readings that defied conventional physics. Compass needles spun wildly, atomic clocks lost synchronization, and his recording equipment captured sounds that seemed to come from multiple time periods simultaneously. Dr. Wright's most disturbing discovery came when he attempted to leave Hollow Creek after a 3-day stay. Despite following the same road he'd used to enter the town, he found himself back at the Main Street intersection. This happened 7 times before he abandoned his vehicle and hiked cross-country to escape the valley. When he finally reached the nearest town and called for help, authorities found his car exactly where he'd left it, but according to the parking meter, it had been there for 3 weeks, not 3 days. The third town on our list is Greystone, Tennessee, population unknown. Official records list it as a former mining community abandoned in the 1960s, but satellite imagery shows occupied buildings and clear signs of current habitation. The discrepancy between official records and observable reality is just the beginning of Greystone's mysteries. Greystone sits at the end of a winding mountain road that seems to change configuration depending on when you travel it. Morning visitors report a smooth, well-maintained asphalt road with clear signage. Those who attempt the journey in the afternoon often find themselves on a narrow dirt track with no signs at all. Evening travelers describe a road that seems to shift and move, with familiar landmarks appearing in different locations from one moment to the next. The town itself presents a jarring mixture of time periods. Victorian-era houses sit next to 1950s diners and modern gas stations, all seemingly in active use. The residents dress in clothing from various decades, often within the same family. A grandmother might wear a 1940s dress while her granddaughter sports 1980s fashion, and they'll both reference current events from their respective eras as if they're happening simultaneously. What makes Greystone particularly treacherous is its effect on visitors' perception of reality. Multiple accounts describe the same phenomenon. Newcomers gradually lose their ability to distinguish between past and present. They'll find themselves participating in conversations about events that happened decades ago, attending social gatherings where the music, food, and customs reflect different time periods, and slowly forgetting why they came to the town in the first place. The Brennan family's experience in Greystone has become something of a legend among paranormal researchers. In 2018, they stopped in the town while driving to a family reunion in Tennessee. They intended to stay for lunch and maybe visit the local antique shops. According to their relatives, they never arrived at the reunion. A search party found them 3 days later, sitting in the town's diner, dressed in 1950s clothing and speaking as if they'd been residents for years. They had no memory of their previous lives and insisted they'd always lived in Greystone. More disturbing was what happened when family members tried to convince them to leave. The Brennans became increasingly agitated, claiming that the outside world was dangerous and that Greystone was the only safe place left. They spoke of events happening in the current year as if they were distant future occurrences, too frightening to contemplate. Eventually, the family members had to leave without them. The Brennans remain in Greystone to this day, reportedly aging much slower than normal and continuing to live as if it's perpetually 1953. Our fourth location is Ravens Hollow, Kentucky, a community that technically doesn't exist. There are no official records of its founding, no census data, and no government services. Yet it appears on some older maps, and locals in surrounding areas occasionally mention it in hushed conversations. The town sits in a valley so isolated that it receives no mail service, has no telephone lines, and generates its own electricity through unknown means. What makes Ravens Hollow particularly sinister is its apparent ability to call to people who are at vulnerable moments in their lives. Multiple accounts describe individuals who are dealing with personal crises, financial troubles, or family problems suddenly feeling an overwhelming urge to drive into the mountains. They'll find themselves on unfamiliar roads, following signs that seem to appear and disappear until they arrive at a town they've never heard of, but somehow feel they've been looking for their entire lives. The residents of Ravens Hollow seem to know intimate details about their visitors' problems and offer solutions that appear too good to be true. They'll provide job opportunities that perfectly match someone's skills, offer living accommodations that are exactly what someone needs, and create social connections that fill emotional voids. The catch, according to those few who've managed to leave, is that these solutions come with invisible strings attached. Former visitors describe a gradual process of integration that feels natural at first. They're welcomed into the community, given meaningful work, and made to feel valued in ways they never experienced in the outside world. But slowly, they begin to notice restrictions. They're discouraged from contacting people outside the town, told that the outside world is becoming increasingly dangerous and chaotic. Communication devices stop working, vehicles develop mechanical problems, and the mountain roads become increasingly treacherous. The most disturbing aspect of Raven's Hollow is what happens to those who try to leave after becoming integrated into the community. They report feeling physically ill when they approach the town limits, experiencing panic attacks and disorientation that forces them to return. Some describe it as if the town itself is alive and refuses to let them go. Others speak of feeling like they're betraying a family that truly loves them. Guilt so overwhelming that leaving becomes emotionally impossible. Our final location is perhaps the most dangerous of all, Whisperwood, Virginia, a town that may exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Visitors report arriving at what appears to be a normal small town, but gradually noticing that there are multiple versions of the same buildings, the same streets, and even the same people existing in the same space. It's as if several different timelines of the town's history are all occurring at once, overlapping and intersecting in ways that defy rational explanation. The residents of Whisperwood seem to move between these different versions of their town effortlessly, aging and growing younger, appearing and disappearing, existing in multiple states simultaneously. They'll reference events that happened in different decades as if they're all part of the same continuous present. A shopkeeper might sell you goods using 1920s prices while discussing current events from 2023, then suddenly appear aged by decades while continuing the same conversation. What makes Whisperwood particularly hazardous is its effect on visitors' sense of self. People report gradually losing track of which version of themselves they're supposed to be. They'll find themselves with memories of lives they never lived, relationships with people they've never met, and knowledge of events they never experienced. The boundaries between their actual identity and the various possible versions of themselves begin to blur until they can no longer distinguish between reality and possibility. The town seems to feed on this confusion, growing stronger as visitors become more disoriented. Some accounts describe people who've been in Whisperwood for what feels like days, only to discover they've been missing for months or even years. Others report the opposite experience, spending what seems like years in the town, only to emerge and find that no time has passed at all in the outside world. The few documented escapes from Whisperwood describe a harrowing process of fighting to remember who they really are, while being constantly tempted by alternative versions of themselves that seem more appealing. They speak of having to choose between multiple possible lives, multiple possible identities, and multiple possible futures, all while the town whispers seductively about the paths not taken and the lives that could still be lived. What connects all 5 of these towns is their location in the oldest mountains on Earth, in regions where human habitation stretches back thousands of years. These are places where the normal rules of reality seem to bend, where time moves differently, and where the boundary between what is and what could be becomes dangerously thin. They represent something that exists in the spaces between our understanding of the world, something that feeds on human desires for belonging, purpose, and escape from the difficulties of modern life. The Appalachian Mountains have always been a place where people go to disappear, whether by choice or by circumstance. But these 5 towns take that concept to its logical and terrifying conclusion. They offer everything that people think they want: community, purpose, freedom from the complexities of modern life, and escape from personal problems. The price, however, is higher than most people realize until it's too late to pay it. So the next time you find yourself driving through the winding mountain roads of Appalachia and you see a sign pointing toward a town you've never heard of, remember these stories. Sometimes the most dangerous places are the ones that promise to give you exactly what you think you need. Now let's dig deeper into what makes these places so unnaturally dangerous. See, most people think it's just folklore when they hear about towns where visitors vanish without a trace. But there's a pattern here that goes beyond simple superstition. These aren't random disappearances or tragic accidents. Something about these specific locations fundamentally alters the relationship between reality and those who enter their boundaries. Take Millfield, for instance. This settlement sits in a valley so remote that modern GPS systems struggle to maintain consistent coordinates. The town appears on maps from the 1800s, yet census records show no official population count since 1923. What happened to the residents? Here's where it gets truly unsettling. According to the few documented accounts from regional historians, Millfield exists in what researchers call temporal displacement. Time doesn't flow normally there. Visitors report arriving in what appears to be a thriving community, complete with bustling shops, horse-drawn carriages, and residents dressed in period clothing. They engage in conversations with locals who speak of current events from decades or even centuries past. The townspeople seem genuinely unaware that time has moved forward beyond their existence. They'll discuss the upcoming harvest festival planned for next month, referencing a celebration that historical records show last occurred in 1891. But here's the truly disturbing part. These visitors don't just observe this temporal anomaly from the outside, they become part of it. Their own sense of time begins to distort. What feels like a few hours of exploration turns into days, weeks, or months of missing time in the outside world. Search parties find abandoned vehicles at the valley's entrance, but the occupants have simply vanished. When some do eventually return, they carry pocket watches that have stopped at impossible times, or they speak of conversations with people who died generations ago. The most chilling account comes from a geological survey team that entered Millfield in 1987. Only one member returned, and he emerged 3 months after the team was reported missing. His journal, which he believed documented a single afternoon's work, contained entries spanning what appeared to be several years. He wrote of attending town meetings, participating in seasonal celebrations, and forming friendships with residents. Yet his physical appearance suggested he'd aged only days, not the years his journal suggested he'd experienced. Moving deeper into these mysteries, we encounter Hollow Creek, where the very landscape seems to shift and change. This town doesn't just trap visitors through temporal displacement, it actively hunts them. The settlement appears perfectly normal when approached from the main road, a typical mountain community with modest homes and a small business district. But something fundamental changes the moment you cross the town limits. The geography itself becomes unreliable. Streets that were clearly visible moments before simply disappear. Buildings rearrange themselves when you're not looking directly at them. The local diner might be on the corner of Main and Oak when you enter, but when you leave, you find yourself exiting onto a completely different street that maps insist doesn't exist. Residents of Hollow Creek display an unsettling knowledge of visitors' personal histories. They'll greet strangers by name, reference childhood memories that should be impossible for them to know, and speak of family members who died years ago as if they'd just spoken with them yesterday. One visitor reported having a lengthy conversation with an elderly woman who accurately described his grandmother's apple pie recipe, down to the secret ingredient his grandmother never shared with anyone. The woman then casually mentioned that she'd learned it from his grandmother just last week, despite the fact that his grandmother had been dead for 15 years. The town's phone book, when visitors manage to find one, lists residents with their current addresses and phone numbers. But it also includes entries for people who died decades ago, complete with active phone numbers that, when called, connect to voices that sound exactly like the deceased individuals. These conversations aren't recordings or imitations. The voices respond to current events, ask about family members by name, and demonstrate knowledge that only the actual deceased person would possess. What makes Hollow Creek particularly insidious is how it preys on human emotion. The town seems to identify what visitors miss most about their lives, then provides a twisted version of it. Those grieving lost loved ones encounter perfect replicas of the deceased. People struggling with loneliness find themselves welcomed into a community that seems to fulfill their deepest needs for belonging. But these gifts come with an invisible price. The longer visitors stay, the more they become integrated into the town's impossible reality, until they lose the ability to distinguish between what's real and what's a creation of Hollow Creek's influence. Greystone presents a different kind of horror entirely. This town exists in a state of perpetual repetition, where the same events unfold day after day with minor variations. Visitors initially dismiss this as small-town routine, but gradually realize they're witnessing something far more sinister. The town operates on a loop, with residents going through the motions of daily life without any awareness that they're repeating the same conversations, the same activities, the same interactions over and over again. A family from Ohio documented their experience in Greystone through a series of photographs taken over what they believed was a week-long stay. When they finally escaped and had their film developed, they discovered something impossible. The photographs showed the same scenes repeated dozens of times, but with subtle differences. The same group of children playing in the town square, but wearing different clothes. The same shopkeeper arranging the same display, but with items in slightly different positions. The same elderly man feeding pigeons on the same bench, but with varying numbers of birds. What's most disturbing about Greystone is how visitors gradually become part of the loop. They find themselves having the same conversations with residents, visiting the same locations, eating the same meals. Initially, they retain awareness of the repetition, but as days pass, their memory of previous iterations begins to fade. They start to believe each repeated day is their first experience of these events. The loop becomes their reality, and they lose the ability to imagine existence outside of it. The few who've escaped Greystone report that breaking free requires an almost superhuman effort of will. They must consciously resist the town's influence, deliberately choosing to act differently than the loop demands. Even then, the town fights back. Roads that should lead out of Greystone instead circle back to the town center. Vehicles break down just as visitors reach the town limits. Phone calls to the outside world connect to numbers that don't exist, or to people who speak as if they're also trapped in various loops. Raven's Hollow operates on an entirely different principle. This town doesn't trap visitors through time distortion or geographic manipulation. Instead, it slowly erases their identity, replacing their memories and personality with those of long-dead residents. The process is so gradual that visitors don't realize what's happening until it's too late. The town maintains detailed records of everyone who's ever lived there, dating back to its founding in 1823. These records include not just vital statistics, but intimate details about residents' personalities, relationships, fears, and dreams. As visitors spend time in Raven's Hollow, they begin to experience memories that aren't their own. They recall childhood experiences that took place in the town decades before they were born. They feel inexplicable, emotional connections to locations and people they've never encountered. One documented case involves a woman who entered Raven's Hollow while researching her family genealogy. She intended to spend a single afternoon at the local historical society, but ended up staying for several weeks. During this time, she began experiencing vivid dreams about life in the town during the 1940s. She dreamed of working at the local general store, of falling in love with a young man who died in World War II, of raising children who grew up to become prominent community members. These weren't typical dreams, but detailed, consistent experiences that felt more real than her actual memories. She began to remember the exact layout of buildings that had been demolished decades earlier, the names of pets that had belonged to families she'd never met, the taste of recipes that had been passed down through generations of families she had no connection to. Gradually, her own memories began to fade, replaced by the experiences of a woman named Sarah who had lived in Raven's Hollow from 1923 to 1967. When she finally left the town, she carried with her a complete set of false memories. She remembered Sarah's life as if it were her own, while her actual childhood, education, and adult relationships became increasingly vague and dreamlike. Medical examinations revealed no physical cause for her memory loss, but psychological evaluation showed that she genuinely believed she was Sarah, temporarily inhabiting someone else's body. Finally, there's Whisperwood, perhaps the most dangerous of these settlements, because it offers exactly what visitors think they want. This town appears to be a perfect community where everyone is welcome, where problems are quickly resolved, and where life unfolds with an almost magical sense of harmony and purpose. Visitors are immediately embraced by friendly residents who seem genuinely interested in their well-being and eager to help them find their place in the community. The town offers opportunities that seem too good to be true. Struggling artists find galleries eager to display their work. Unemployed individuals discover perfect job opportunities that match their skills exactly. Those seeking love encounter potential partners who seem ideally suited to them. People fleeing difficult circumstances find not just refuge, but a chance to start completely new lives free from their past troubles. But Whisperwood's perfection comes with a price that becomes apparent only after it's too late to escape. The town feeds on human hope and ambition, gradually consuming the very qualities that make visitors unique. The artist who finds success in Whisperwood's galleries discovers that their creativity slowly diminishes until they can only produce work that pleases the town's residents. The person who finds love realizes that their partner changes subtly over time, becoming less of an individual and more of a reflection of what the town believes they want. Most insidiously, Whisperwood makes visitors complicit in their own entrapment. The town doesn't force people to stay through supernatural barriers or temporal manipulation. Instead, it creates circumstances that make leaving seem increasingly impossible. The artist becomes financially dependent on the gallery. The person who found love becomes emotionally dependent on their partner. Those who tried to escape their past find that their problems have mysteriously resolved themselves, but only within the town's borders. When visitors finally realize what's happening, they discover that Whisperwood has anticipated their desire to leave. The town has systematically eliminated their connections to the outside world. Their former homes have been sold, their jobs have been filled by others, their relationships have withered from neglect. The town hasn't just trapped their bodies, it has carefully dismantled their ability to exist anywhere else. These 5 towns represent something that challenges our understanding of reality itself. They exist in regions where the normal rules of time, space, and identity become fluid. They prey on fundamental human needs, offering distorted versions of what we seek most desperately: time and belonging, purpose and love, success and acceptance. But they provide these things in forms that ultimately destroy the very people they claim to help. The Appalachian Mountains have always been a place where the boundary between the known and unknown grows thin. These ancient peaks have witnessed countless human stories, many of them tragic, many of them unexplained. In certain remote valleys and forgotten hollows, those stories seem to have taken on a life of their own, creating places where reality bends to accommodate impossible narratives. What makes these towns so dangerous isn't just their supernatural properties, but how perfectly they understand human psychology. They don't trap visitors through force or obvious deception. Instead, they offer exactly what each person needs most, then slowly transform that gift into a prison. They exploit our deepest vulnerabilities, our strongest desires, our most desperate needs. The question isn't whether these places actually exist, but what they represent about the darker aspects of human nature and the prices we're willing to pay for what we think we want. In our search for meaning, belonging, and escape from life's difficulties, how far are we willing to go? And at what point does the solution become worse than the problem we're trying to solve? These towns continue to exist in the misty valleys and hidden hollows of Appalachia, waiting for the next desperate soul seeking something they can't find in the ordinary world. They offer hope, community, love, success, and purpose. But they demand payment in the form of the very humanity that makes these things valuable in the first place. When you step into Greystone, Tennessee, population 847, you'll notice something unsettling about the locals. They all seem to be exactly where they should be, doing exactly what they should be doing, at exactly the right time. The mailman delivers mail at 2:17 p.m. every day. The diner serves the same lunch special every Tuesday. Children walk to school along identical routes, their footsteps falling in patterns worn smooth by countless repetitions. But here's what makes Greystone truly terrifying. These aren't just routines, they're loops, perfect, inescapable loops that trap everyone who stays long enough to become part of the pattern. The town sits in a valley so deep that cell phone towers can't reach it, so isolated that GPS signals bounce off the surrounding ridges like echoes in a canyon. Most visitors arrive by accident, taking what they think is a shortcut through the mountains, only to find themselves on Main Street with no clear memory of how they got there. The Welcome to Greystone sign at the town limits is weathered and faded, but the paint never seems to chip in new places. It's always weathered in exactly the same way. The rust stains on the metal post form the same patterns, positioned at the same angles, as if time itself has stopped caring about the passage of seasons. Sarah Martinez discovered this in 2019 when she photographed that sign during what was supposed to be a quick stop for gas. When she returned to her car and checked the image, she noticed something impossible. The timestamp on her camera showed she'd taken the exact same photograph from the exact same angle at the exact same time of day 3 months earlier, a photograph she had no memory of taking. The gas station attendant, a thin man with deeply lined hands and eyes that never quite focused, took her $20 bill and gave her change in coins that felt unusually warm. When Sarah looked at the quarters later, she noticed they were all dated 1987, all minted in the same year, all bearing the same microscopic scratches in identical patterns. She tried to leave immediately, but the road she'd taken into town simply wasn't there anymore. The GPS showed her location as a blank space between mapped territories. Every route she attempted led her in a wide circle back to Main Street, where the same people walked the same paths, where the same conversations echoed from the same doorways. The hotel clerk, a woman whose age seemed to shift depending on the lighting, offered Sarah a room with a smile that never changed. Room 237, always room 237, with a view of the town square, where the same group of elderly men played checkers on the same board, making the same moves, having the same arguments about rules that never got resolved. Sarah's first night in Greystone, she documented everything. She wrote detailed notes about the people she'd met, the conversations she'd overheard, the strange synchronicities that seemed to govern every interaction. She photographed the wallpaper in her room, the arrangement of furniture, the way shadows fell across the floor at specific times. The next morning, she woke to find her notes had changed, not erased, but altered. The words were in her handwriting, but they described different conversations, different people, different events. The photographs showed the same room, but with subtle differences. A chair moved slightly to the left, a picture frame tilted at a different angle, small changes that suggested someone else had been there, living her experiences in parallel. That's when Sarah began to understand the true horror of Greystone. The town doesn't just trap you in loops, it makes you complicit in creating them. Every action you take, every decision you make, becomes part of an endless cycle that you'll repeat forever, with slight variations that keep you believing you're experiencing something new. The breakfast menu at the diner offers 7 items, always the same 7 items, but the daily special rotates through them in a pattern that seems random until you track it long enough to realize it's following a sequence. The waitress, whose name tag reads Dolores in letters that appear freshly printed despite the faded quality of her uniform, always asks if you've decided what you want, even though she's already writing your order on her pad. Sarah ordered scrambled eggs, wheat toast, and coffee. The next morning, she decided to order something different, but found herself saying scrambled eggs, wheat toast, and coffee, as if the words were being pulled from her mouth by an invisible force. Dolores smiled and said, "The usual then," though Sarah had never been to the diner before. By the third morning, Sarah realized she wasn't just repeating her actions, she was improving them. Her movements became more efficient, her conversations more natural, her integration into the town's rhythms more seamless. She was becoming part of the loop, and the loop was becoming part of her. The hardware store owner, whose name was either Frank or Fred depending on who was asking, sold her a notebook to replace the one that kept changing, but the new notebook exhibited the same strange properties. Sarah would write something, close the book, and open it to find her words had shifted, her thoughts had been refined, her observations had been corrected by someone who knew the town better than she did. That someone, Sarah gradually realized, was herself. A future version of herself who had been living these same days, making these same discoveries, writing these same notes for longer than she could comprehend. The handwriting in her notebook wasn't changing. It was evolving, becoming more practiced, more familiar with the rhythms of Greystone's eternal present. The town's small library contained exactly 847 books, one for each resident. Sarah found her name in the card catalog, directing her to a volume she'd never seen before, Observations of a Temporary Resident by Sarah Martinez. The book was filled with her handwriting, documenting experiences she hadn't had yet, conversations she hadn't engaged in, realizations she hadn't reached. Reading her own future thoughts was like looking into a mirror that showed not your reflection, but your destiny. The book described her growing comfort with the town's routines, her eventual acceptance of the loops, her transformation from visitor to resident. The final entry, dated 10 years in the future, read, "Today I helped a new visitor understand what this place really is. Her name is Sarah Martinez. She reminds me of someone I used to know. The loops in Greystone aren't just temporal, they're psychological, emotional, spiritual. The town feeds on human need for routine, for predictability, for the comfort of knowing what comes next. It takes that need and amplifies it until routine becomes compulsion, predictability becomes inevitability, and comfort becomes imprisonment." Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a psychologist who studied temporal anomalies before disappearing into the mountains in 2021, theorized that places like Greystone exist at the intersection of human consciousness and geological time. The ancient rock formations that surround the valley have been shaped by millions of years of repeating cycles. Seasons, weather patterns, the slow dance of erosion and deposition. According to her research, which was found in her abandoned car just outside the valley, certain individuals become sensitive to these deep rhythms. They begin to crave the security of repetition, the peace of knowing exactly what will happen next. Greystone offers them that peace, but at a cost. They must give up the possibility of change, of growth, of genuine novelty. The town's children never age, but they're not frozen in time. They're cycling through the same year over and over, experiencing the same lessons, the same friendships, the same small tragedies and triumphs. They remember everything and nothing, carrying the accumulated weight of hundreds of repeated experiences while remaining emotionally locked in their original moment of arrival. Sarah met Tommy, a boy who claimed to be 8 years old, but spoke with the vocabulary of someone much older. He'd been in 3rd grade for what he described as a very long time, but couldn't explain why he wasn't bored with learning the same multiplication tables over and over. Every time feels like the first time, he told her, but also like I've always known the answers. The adults in Greystone have developed a more complex relationship with their loops. They're aware of the repetition, but they've learned to find variations within it. The same conversation can be had with different emotional undertones. The same meal can be savored in different ways. The same walk through town can reveal new details, new perspectives, new moments of beauty or connection. Margaret Fleming, who claims to have arrived in 1987 but looks no older than 40, operates the town's small flower shop. She arranges the same bouquets every day, but each arrangement is subtly different. The flowers teach you, she explained to Sarah. They show you that repetition isn't stagnation, it's refinement. Each time you do something, you can do it a little better, understand it a little more deeply. But refinement has its limits. Sarah began to notice that the residents of Greystone, despite their apparent contentment, exhibited signs of deep psychological strain. They spoke in patterns that revealed the wear of countless repetitions. Their laughter had a hollow quality, their tears seemed practiced, their emotions felt like performances, refined through endless rehearsal. The town's mayor, a man whose titles seemed to rotate among different residents depending on the day, explained the situation with a metaphor that Sarah heard dozens of times, each delivery identical in cadence and emphasis. Think of Greystone as a record player, and we're the music. The song might be the same, but every time it plays, you hear something new. The beauty is in the listening, not in the changing. Yet Sarah noticed that the residents avoided certain topics, certain areas of town, certain times of day. There were gaps in their loops, moments when the pattern broke down and something else showed through. In those moments, she glimpsed the true cost of their eternal repetition, the accumulated weight of experiences that could never be fully processed, emotions that could never be fully resolved, relationships that could never evolve beyond their original parameters. The town's small cemetery contained exactly 847 headstones, each bearing the name of a current resident. The dates of death were all in the future, but the inscriptions were written in past tense, as if the deaths had already occurred. Sarah found her own headstone, marked with tomorrow's date, the inscription reading, "She found peace in the patterns." But the most disturbing discovery came when Sarah realized that the loops weren't just repeating the same events, they were slowly erasing the possibility of different events. With each cycle, the range of possible actions narrowed. Choices that had seemed available yesterday were no longer options today. Conversations that had branched in different directions were becoming more predictable, more constrained. The town was consuming possibility itself, feeding on the infinite potential that exists in every moment and reducing it to a single, predetermined outcome. The residents weren't just trapped in loops, they were being digested by them, their essential humanity slowly processed into something more manageable, more predictable, more useful to whatever force had created this place. Sarah's final escape attempt came when she realized that the loops weren't perfect. There were tiny inconsistencies, moments when the pattern stuttered or skipped. During these glitches, she could see the edges of the trap, the places where Greystone's influence weakened. But reaching those edges required perfect timing, split-second decisions, and a willingness to sacrifice the growing comfort she'd found in the town's rhythms. The choice she faced was the same one that had confronted every visitor to Greystone: accept the peace of eternal repetition or fight for the chaotic freedom of an uncertain future. The town made that choice as difficult as possible, offering not just comfort, but genuine beauty, meaningful connections, and the deep satisfaction of mastering a limited but perfect existence. Some visitors chose to stay. Others, like Sarah, chose to leave, carrying with them the knowledge that somewhere in the mountains, a town exists where time moves in circles, where every day is both the first and the last, where the human need for certainty has been fulfilled in the most terrible way possible. Those who escape report that the experience changes them permanently. They find themselves craving routine while simultaneously fearing it, appreciating spontaneity while mourning the loss of Greystone's perfect predictability. They've seen what lies at the end of humanity's desire for control, and they know that some forms of peace are too expensive to afford. The road to Greystone still appears on outdated maps, marked as a scenic route through the mountains. But modern GPS systems can't locate it, and satellite imagery shows only empty forest where the town should be. It exists in the spaces between certainty and possibility, waiting for travelers who need its particular kind of peace more than they need their freedom. Now we've explored the supernatural mechanics of these 5 towns, but understanding how they operate is only half the story. What makes these places truly insidious isn't just their otherworldly properties, it's how they exploit the deepest human needs and vulnerabilities. Each town functions as a perfect trap designed to capture specific types of people during their most desperate moments. Think about it. Nobody stumbles into these places by accident. There's always a reason, always a need driving them forward. Millfield draws those running from their past, people so desperate to escape their history that they'll accept any alternative, even one that traps them in an endless cycle of reincarnation. The town feeds on regret, on the human inability to accept that some things can't be undone. Hollow Creek attracts a different kind of victim entirely. It calls to those drowning in nostalgia, people who've convinced themselves that life was better in some imagined golden age. The town offers them exactly what they think they want: a chance to live in the past, to interact with history itself. But what they discover too late is that the past they're experiencing isn't their past. It's a carefully constructed fiction designed to keep them permanently displaced from their own timeline. The selection process is remarkably sophisticated. Former residents of Hollow Creek, those few who managed to escape, describe feeling an overwhelming sense of homesickness months before they ever visited the town. They'd find themselves constantly thinking about their childhood, about simpler times, about how much better things used to be. This psychological conditioning makes them perfect candidates for the town's temporal displacement. Greystone operates on an entirely different principle. It targets people who feel overwhelmed by modern life, individuals who crave simplicity and routine. The town presents itself as a peaceful community where everyone knows their place and follows predictable patterns. What visitors don't realize is that this isn't peaceful living. It's a form of consciousness imprisonment. The synchronized routines aren't comforting traditions. They're mental chains that gradually erase individual thought and personality. The most disturbing aspect of Greystone's selection process is how it identifies potential victims. Local records, those few that exist, suggest the town somehow monitors stress levels and social media activity of people within a 50-mile radius. Those showing signs of burnout, depression, or social anxiety receive subtle influences. They might find themselves taking routes that pass near the town or encountering advertisements for bed and breakfasts in the area that don't actually exist anywhere except in their minds. Raven's Hollow presents the most complex psychological trap of all. It doesn't just prey on nostalgia or stress, it feeds on unfulfilled potential. The town somehow identifies people who feel they've settled for less than they deserved, individuals haunted by paths not taken. It offers them a chance to live out their abandoned dreams, but the cost is their authentic memories and relationships. The mechanism is particularly cruel because it forces victims to choose between their current life and their idealized alternative. A middle-aged accountant who once dreamed of being a musician might find themselves living as a successful performer in Raven's Hollow, but they'll gradually lose all memory of their spouse, their children, their real life. The town doesn't just steal their present, it convinces them that their stolen life is better than what they left behind. Whisperwood operates on pure chaos theory. Unlike the other towns, which target specific personality types, Whisperwood seems to attract people who are already fracturing psychologically. Individuals experiencing identity crises, those questioning their life choices, people going through major transitions. The town offers them infinite possibilities by showing them alternate versions of themselves, but this apparent freedom becomes a prison when they can no longer distinguish between their various identities. What makes this particularly insidious is that Whisperwood doesn't just show visitors other versions of themselves, it allows them to experience being those other people. Someone might spend a day as a successful lawyer, another as a famous artist, another as a devoted parent. But each experience fragments their core identity further until they become lost in a maze of possibilities, unable to choose who they actually are. The psychological manipulation extends beyond the individual level. These towns understand family dynamics, social pressures, and cultural expectations. They don't just trap individuals, they create scenarios that make leaving seem impossible or undesirable. A person might find their ideal job in one of these towns, or meet someone who seems like their perfect romantic partner, or discover a community that accepts them completely. The towns are also remarkably adaptive. They evolve their tactics based on changing social conditions and generational differences. What attracted visitors in the 1950s wouldn't work on someone from the 2020s, so the towns update their lures accordingly. Modern visitors to Millfield might find themselves drawn by promises of digital detox and authentic living, while those visiting Hollow Creek might be attracted by artisanal crafts and heritage tourism. Perhaps most disturbing is how these towns create a sense of complicity in their victims. People don't just get trapped, they participate in their own entrapment. They make choices, albeit influenced ones, that lead them deeper into the town's supernatural web. This psychological manipulation makes escape incredibly difficult because victims have to acknowledge their own role in their predicament. The towns also employ what researchers call graduated commitment. They don't reveal their true nature immediately. Instead, they gradually increase their hold on visitors through a series of small compromises. Someone might initially plan to stay for a weekend, then decide to extend their visit by a few days, then a week, then indefinitely. Each decision seems reasonable in isolation, but together they form a chain of commitment that becomes increasingly difficult to break. The social dynamics within these towns further complicate escape attempts. Long-term residents, whether willing or unwilling, often work to keep newcomers from leaving. This might be because they need new arrivals to maintain the town's supernatural functions, or because seeing others escape would force them to confront their own trapped status. Whatever the reason, potential escapees often find themselves facing not just supernatural obstacles, but social pressure from the very people they might expect to help them. What's particularly chilling is how these towns corrupt the very human needs they claim to fulfill. The desire for community becomes enforced conformity. The search for purpose becomes loss of identity. The need for belonging becomes imprisonment. They take humanity's greatest strengths, our social bonds and our capacity for hope, and transform them into mechanisms of control. The geographic isolation of these towns isn't accidental either. Being located in remote areas of Appalachia provides multiple advantages. It limits outside interference, makes escape more difficult, and allows the towns to operate without scrutiny. But more importantly, it taps into deep-seated cultural associations with the American frontier, with self-reliance and finding one's place in the world. These towns represent a fundamental perversion of the American dream. They offer everything people think they want: success, community, purpose, simplicity, infinite possibility. But they deliver these things in ways that ultimately destroy the human spirit. They're not just supernatural anomalies, they're dark mirrors reflecting our own desires and fears, showing us what happens when we get exactly what we think we want. The tragedy is that the needs these towns exploit are legitimate human needs. People genuinely do need community, purpose, and belonging. They need to feel that their lives have meaning and that they have some control over their destiny. These towns take these universal human needs and twist them into snares, creating perfect psychological traps that their victims help to build around themselves. In the end, these 5 towns serve as a warning about the dangers of seeking easy solutions to complex human problems. They remind us that anything that seems too good to be true probably is, and that the most dangerous traps are often the ones that give us exactly what we think we want. The real horror isn't the supernatural elements. It's the recognition that we might willingly walk into such places ourselves, drawn by our own unfulfilled desires and unresolved needs. When you peel back the layers of these particular Appalachian mysteries, you start to understand something deeply unsettling about human psychology. These 5 towns didn't just appear overnight, manifesting their supernatural properties through some cosmic accident. No, something far more disturbing is at work here. Each of these places seems to have evolved specifically to exploit the very things that make us human, our deepest needs, our most desperate longings, our fundamental vulnerabilities. Think about it for a moment. Millfield targets our desire to escape, to leave behind the pressures and disappointments of modern life. But what starts as a weekend retreat becomes a psychological trap where time itself becomes your enemy. Hollow Creek preys on nostalgia, that bittersweet ache for simpler times that never quite existed the way we remember them. It offers the perfect small-town experience, complete with memories you never actually lived. Greystone feeds on our need for routine, for predictability in a chaotic world. But routine becomes ritual, and ritual becomes compulsion, until you're trapped in patterns that no longer serve any purpose except to keep you anchored to a place that shouldn't exist. Raven's Hollow is perhaps the most insidious because it targets unfulfilled potential. How many of us lie awake at night, wondering what might have been? What if I'd taken that job? What if I'd moved to that city? What if I'd been braver, smarter, more decisive? The town offers you the chance to explore those alternate paths, to see who you might have become. But every choice you make there creates another version of yourself, another life to live, another possibility to explore. The residents aren't just trapped by the town's geography, they're trapped by infinite possibility itself. And then there's Whisperwood, feeding on our most basic human need for connection, for community, for belonging. In our increasingly isolated world, the promise of a place where everyone knows your name, where you matter, where you're truly seen and valued, becomes irresistible. But the warmth of that community comes with invisible chains. The more you're welcomed, the more you're expected to stay. The more you belong, the less you're able to leave. What makes these places so terrifying isn't their supernatural elements. It's how perfectly they reflect our own psychological traps. How many of us are already living in Millfield, escaping into endless distractions instead of facing our problems? How many are stuck in Hollow Creek, romanticizing a past that never existed while missing the present moment? How many have built their own Greystone, following routines that have become prisons, afraid to break patterns that no longer serve them? The residents of Raven's Hollow, paralyzed by infinite possibility, mirror our own decision paralysis in a world of endless choices. And Whisperwood's suffocating community reflects how we sometimes sacrifice our individual identity for the comfort of belonging, staying in relationships, jobs, or situations that drain us because leaving feels impossible. These towns represent the shadow side of human desire. They're what happens when our deepest needs become twisted into their own opposites. The escape becomes imprisonment, the nostalgia becomes delusion, the routine becomes compulsion, the possibility becomes paralysis, the community becomes cult. But here's what's most disturbing about these places. They don't force anyone to stay. They don't use chains or locks or physical barriers. They simply offer people exactly what they think they want, then let human psychology do the rest. The trap isn't external, it's internal. The prison isn't made of bars, it's made of our own desires turned against us. The few who do escape these places share similar stories. They all describe a moment of clarity, a sudden understanding that what they thought they wanted was actually destroying them. The businessman who realized that escaping his stress meant escaping his life. The couple who understood that their perfect nostalgic romance was built on lies. The writer who saw that his comfortable routine had become a creative coffin. The artist who recognized that exploring infinite possibilities meant never committing to any single path. The lonely woman who discovered that belonging at any cost meant losing herself entirely. These moments of clarity seem to break whatever hold these places have on their residents. But they're rare. Most people who find themselves in these towns never have that realization. They're too comfortable, too satisfied, too convinced that they've found exactly what they were looking for. The real horror of these Appalachian mysteries isn't supernatural at all. It's the recognition that we might already be living in our own versions of these towns. We might already be trapped by our own desires, imprisoned by our own needs, held captive by the very things we thought would set us free. The mountains of Appalachia have always been a place where people go to disappear. Some are running from the law, others from their past, still others from themselves. But these 5 towns suggest something more sinister. They're not just places where people disappear. They're places where people disappear willingly, enthusiastically, convinced they've found paradise even as they're being consumed by it. The question isn't whether these places really exist. The question is whether we'd recognize them if we found them. Would we see the trap, or would we see the answer to our prayers? Would we notice the warning signs, or would we be too busy feeling grateful that we'd finally found what we'd been searching for? In the end, these Appalachian mysteries serve as a mirror, reflecting back our own capacity for self-deception, our own willingness to trade freedom for comfort, authenticity for belonging, growth for security. They show us that the most dangerous prisons are the ones we choose, the ones that feel like home, the ones that give us exactly what we think we want. The mountains keep their secrets, but perhaps the most frightening secret of all is how much we have in common with those who never came back. How easily we might make the same choices, fall into the same traps, mistake our own psychological prisons for paradise found. The psychological grip these places hold on their victims reveals something far more unsettling than supernatural phenomena. It exposes the fundamental vulnerability of human nature itself. Each of these towns succeeds because they offer what we secretly crave: escape from responsibility, validation of our choices, and most dangerously, permission to stop fighting for something better. Consider how Millfield attracts those seeking to disappear from their obligations. The town doesn't force anyone to stay. Instead, it provides the perfect excuse to abandon everything they've built in the outside world. Visitors convince themselves they've found paradise, but what they've actually discovered is a sophisticated trap that feeds on their desire to avoid consequences. The town becomes a mirror, reflecting their own cowardice back at them, disguised as contentment. Hollow Creek operates on a different but equally insidious principle. It targets those drowning in regret, offering them the chance to relive moments when life felt simpler. But the past it provides isn't real healing or genuine resolution. It's emotional quicksand that pulls victims deeper into nostalgia until they lose the ability to distinguish between memory and reality. The town becomes a drug that numbs the pain of growth and change, keeping its inhabitants trapped in a perpetual state of arrested development. Greystone represents perhaps the most common trap of all, the seductive comfort of routine. In a world that demands constant adaptation and decision-making, the town offers the ultimate relief from choice. Residents surrender their agency in exchange for predictability, but this bargain transforms them into automatons. They become so afraid of disruption that they lose the capacity for genuine human experience. The town feeds on their fear of uncertainty, gradually eroding their humanity until only the shell of routine remains. Raven's Hollow preys on a different vulnerability, the paralyzing weight of unfulfilled potential. It attracts those who've built their identity around dreams they've never pursued, offering them a place where they can maintain the illusion of eventual success without ever taking actual steps toward achievement. The town becomes a repository for broken ambitions, allowing residents to live in a perpetual state of someday while their actual lives slip away unnoticed. Whisperwood represents the darkest trap of all, the complete surrender of identity. It attracts those who've grown tired of being themselves, offering them the chance to become someone else entirely. But this transformation comes at the cost of coherent selfhood. Residents become fragments of personalities, shifting between different identities without ever achieving genuine change or growth. The town feeds on their self-hatred, convincing them that chaos is preferable to the hard work of self-improvement. What makes these psychological traps so effective is how they exploit our deepest fears and desires simultaneously. They offer false solutions to real problems, providing just enough relief to keep victims engaged while slowly destroying their capacity for genuine happiness. The towns become emotional parasites, feeding on human weakness while convincing their hosts that they're being nourished. The most chilling aspect of these places isn't their supernatural abilities, but how they reveal the extent to which we can become complicit in our own destruction. Each town succeeds because its victims want to be trapped. They arrive seeking escape, comfort, certainty, validation, or transformation, and the towns provide just enough of these things to keep them satisfied while slowly consuming their souls. This willingness to trade freedom for the illusion of safety, growth for the comfort of stagnation, and authentic experience for pleasant delusion reveals something profound about human nature. We are creatures capable of extraordinary resilience and growth, but we're also vulnerable to the temptation of easy answers and false comfort. These towns represent the logical extreme of our tendency to choose the path of least resistance, even when that path leads to spiritual death. The people who never leave these places don't stay because they can't escape. They stay because they no longer want to. The towns gradually erode their victims' desire for genuine life, replacing it with artificial satisfaction. This process happens so slowly and subtly that victims convince themselves they're making conscious choices, even as their capacity for authentic choice diminishes. What's most disturbing about these psychological prisons is how they mirror patterns we see in everyday life. How many people choose jobs that slowly drain their creativity because they offer security? How many relationships continue long past their expiration date because ending them would require difficult decisions? How many dreams die not from external obstacles, but from our own fear of pursuing them? These Appalachian towns represent the extreme version of traps we create for ourselves every day. They remind us that the greatest dangers we face aren't external threats, but internal weaknesses. Our desire for comfort, our fear of change, our need for validation, and our tendency to avoid difficult truths can all become prisons if we're not careful. The horror of these places lies not in their supernatural abilities, but in how they reflect our own capacity for self-deception. They show us what happens when we stop fighting for growth, when we choose comfort over challenge, when we prioritize feeling good over being good. They reveal that the most dangerous prisons are those we build ourselves, furnished with our own justifications and decorated with our own rationalizations. In the end, these towns succeed because they offer their victims exactly what they think they want, while slowly destroying what they actually need. They provide escape instead of growth, comfort instead of strength, certainty instead of wisdom, validation instead of truth, and chaos instead of authentic change. They become monuments to human weakness, feeding on our deepest fears while convincing us they're granting our deepest desires. The real question isn't whether these places exist in some remote corner of Appalachia. The real question is whether we're building similar traps in our own lives, choosing the comfortable lie over the difficult truth, the easy path over the meaningful journey. Because in the end, the most dangerous thing about these towns isn't their supernatural power to trap visitors. It's their ability to show us how easily we can trap ourselves. Now, the most chilling aspect of these 5 towns isn't just their individual methods of entrapment, it's the growing evidence that they're connected, part of something larger that's been slowly spreading through the Appalachian Mountains for over a century. The connections started becoming apparent when researchers noticed disturbing patterns. Maps from the 1800s show hiking trails and old logging roads that once connected these locations, creating what locals called the Shadow Circuit. These paths were mysteriously abandoned in the early 1900s, with no official explanation for their closure. More unsettling, multiple witnesses have reported seeing the same figures in different towns. The woman in Victorian dress glimpsed in Millfield's general store has been photographed in Hollow Creek's cemetery. The children heard laughing in Greystone's playground have been recorded singing in Whisperwood's abandoned school. But it gets worse. Phone records from the past decade reveal that cell towers near these towns have been picking up signals from devices that should no longer exist. Phones belonging to people who disappeared years ago continue to ping nearby towers, sending automated data packets at precisely 3:33 a.m. every night. The data, when decoded, appears to be location coordinates, always pointing to one of the other 4 towns. What's perhaps most disturbing is how these places seem to be learning from each other. Millfield's time loops have become more sophisticated, now incorporating memories from visitors to other towns. People trapped in Hollow Creek report experiencing false memories of childhoods in Greystone. The geographic anomalies around Raven's Hollow have started appearing near Whisperwood, as if the phenomenon is spreading. Local historians have uncovered references to something called the convergence, mentioned in scattered journal entries from the 1920s. According to these fragmented accounts, the 5 towns were once ordinary settlements until something arrived in the region. The journals describe a presence that moved between communities, making offers to desperate residents. Each town accepted different bargains, but all involved the same price. They would become way stations for something that feeds on human longing and unfulfilled dreams. The most credible theory comes from Dr. Sarah Chen, a researcher who spent 3 years studying disappearances in the region before she herself vanished near Millfield in 2021. Her final research notes, discovered in her abandoned campsite, described the towns as components of a larger organism. She theorized that each location serves a specific function. Millfield harvests escapism, Hollow Creek collects nostalgia, Greystone feeds on routine, Raven's Hollow consumes unrealized potential, and Whisperwood devours the need for belonging. According to Dr. Chen's research, the entity behind these towns isn't malevolent in the traditional sense. It's more like a cosmic recycling system, taking human desires that have become too intense, too desperate, and transforming them into something else. The people who disappear aren't necessarily dead. They've become part of the towns themselves, their consciousness scattered across the landscape, their deepest longings incorporated into the very phenomena that trap new visitors. This explains why the towns feel so alive, why visitors report sensing invisible presences watching them. The missing people are still there, their awareness distributed through the streets, buildings, and surrounding forests. They've become the mechanism by which each location identifies and exploits new vulnerabilities in fresh arrivals. The most terrifying implication is that these towns are just the beginning. Satellite imagery analysis has identified 17 other locations across the Appalachian Range showing similar anomalies. Small communities where GPS fails, where time moves strangely, where visitors report feeling watched by something they can't identify. The pattern is spreading, following the ancient ridgelines and forgotten valleys where desperate people have always sought refuge from the modern world. Emergency services have quietly begun tracking what they call the Appalachian anomaly. Search and rescue teams report increasing numbers of missing persons cases in remote mountain areas, with witnesses describing similar phenomena, time distortions, geographic impossibilities, and an overwhelming sense of being offered exactly what they need most. The cases follow a predictable pattern. Someone facing a personal crisis ventures into the mountains seeking solitude or answers, only to encounter a place that promises to solve their problems. What makes this phenomenon particularly insidious is how it preys on genuine human needs. These aren't random supernatural attacks. They're calculated responses to psychological vulnerability. The towns don't take everyone who visits. They're selective, choosing people whose desperation has reached a critical threshold, whose desire for escape, belonging, or transformation has become strong enough to override their survival instincts. The survivors, the few who've managed to leave these places, all report the same final detail. As they fled, they felt an overwhelming urge to return, not out of fear, but out of longing. They describe the towns as feeling more real than reality, more satisfying than any experience they'd ever had. Several have been found months later, hiking back toward the same locations, carrying supplies for extended stays, their eyes reflecting a strange contentment that their families find more disturbing than any terror would be. The ultimate horror isn't that these towns trap people, it's that they offer exactly what their victims truly want, and that gift is so perfect, so precisely calibrated to fill the emptiness in their souls that leaving feels like a betrayal of their deepest selves. The towns don't just imprison bodies, they liberate people from the burden of unsatisfied desire by making that desire eternal, unchanging, and perpetually almost fulfilled. This is why the Appalachian Mountains remain dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with bears or weather. In those ancient hollows, something waits that understands human nature better than we understand ourselves. It knows that our greatest prison isn't built of bars or walls, but of our own desperate longing for something better, something more, something that will finally make us whole. The 5 towns are just the beginning. They're proof that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones that don't hunt us. They're the ones that wait for us to hunt ourselves, following our own desperation into places where desire becomes destiny, and where the price of getting exactly what we want is never being able to want anything else again. These mountains have been whispering secrets for centuries, and tonight we've finally heard what they've been trying to tell us. The stories of Millfield, Hollow Creek, Greystone, Ravens Hollow, and Whisperwood aren't just isolated incidents of supernatural phenomena. They're symptoms of something much larger, something that's been feeding on human desperation and longing since the first settlers carved their paths through these ancient peaks. What we've discovered is that these towns operate as a network, connected by invisible threads of influence that stretch along the old Cherokee trails, the forgotten mining roads, and the abandoned railway lines that once carried hope and prosperity through these valleys. Each town serves a specific function in this cosmic system, targeting different aspects of human vulnerability with surgical precision. Millfield draws in those seeking escape from their present circumstances, offering them the illusion of a simpler time while slowly erasing their connection to reality. Hollow Creek preys on nostalgia and the desire to recapture lost innocence, creating a temporal loop that feeds on the energy of people reliving their happiest memories until those memories become their prison. Greystone targets those trapped in routine and monotony, promising change while actually intensifying their sense of being stuck in an endless cycle. Raven's Hollow is perhaps the most insidious, as it feeds on unfulfilled potential and the regret of roads not taken. It shows visitors versions of themselves that could have been, trapping them in a maze of alternate possibilities that become increasingly difficult to distinguish from reality. Finally, Whisperwood exploits the fundamental human need for belonging and community, creating an artificial sense of acceptance that slowly dissolves individual identity until visitors become indistinguishable from the town itself. But here's what makes this phenomenon truly terrifying. These towns aren't static. They're evolving, adapting to modern anxieties and contemporary forms of desperation. Park rangers and local authorities have reported strange incidents near abandoned shopping centers, defunct factories, and even suburban neighborhoods that seem to exhibit similar properties. The influence is spreading, following the migration patterns of people fleeing economic hardship, seeking new opportunities, or simply trying to start over. The psychological mechanisms at work are devastatingly effective because they exploit genuine human needs: the desire for escape, the longing for simpler times, the need for purpose and belonging. These aren't character flaws or weaknesses. They're fundamental aspects of the human condition. But when these needs become desperate enough, when people are willing to accept any solution regardless of the cost. That's when the mountains begin to call. Recent investigations have uncovered evidence suggesting that these phenomena might be connected to geological anomalies in the region. The Appalachian Mountains contain some of the oldest rock formations on Earth, and certain areas show unusual electromagnetic readings that interfere with electronic equipment and may affect human brain chemistry. Some researchers theorize that these geological factors, combined with the intense emotional history of the region, the displacement of Native American tribes, the brutal exploitation of coal miners, the poverty and isolation that has persisted for generations, have created a kind of psychic resonance that feeds on human suffering. The most disturbing aspect of this discovery is the realization that these towns may not be the cause of the phenomenon, but rather its manifestation. The real entity, if we can call it that, might be something far more ancient and vast than we initially understood. The towns are simply the visible symptoms of a hunger that permeates the entire region, a cosmic appetite that has learned to present itself in forms that appeal to human longing. Consider the pattern. Each town offers exactly what its visitors think they need most, but delivers it in a way that ultimately destroys them. This isn't random predation. It's a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that suggests an intelligence behind the phenomenon. Something that has been observing human behavior for centuries, learning our weaknesses, and perfecting its methods of entrapment. The implications extend far beyond these 5 towns. If this phenomenon can create entire communities that exist primarily to trap and consume human consciousness, what other manifestations might exist? How many missing persons cases, unexplained disappearances, and stories of people who just vanished might actually be connected to similar entities operating in other regions? The most chilling possibility is that these towns represent a kind of test or experiment. The entity behind them might be studying human behavior, learning how to more effectively exploit our psychological vulnerabilities. Each trapped visitor provides data about human desires, fears, and breaking points. The towns themselves might be evolving based on this information, becoming more sophisticated in their methods of entrapment. What we're witnessing isn't just a supernatural phenomenon, it's a form of predation that has adapted to feed on the unique anxieties of modern life. The pace of change, the breakdown of traditional communities, the isolation that comes with digital connectivity, the economic uncertainty that leaves people desperate for any form of security. All of these factors create ideal conditions for this type of psychological predation. The entity doesn't need to use obvious supernatural powers when it can simply offer people what they think they want most: a chance to escape, to belong, to matter, to be understood. These are the most effective traps because they don't feel like traps, they feel like salvation. This is why the phenomenon is so dangerous and why it's spreading. In a world where genuine community is increasingly rare, where economic stability is elusive, where people feel disconnected from meaning and purpose, the promise of a place where these needs can be met becomes almost irresistible. The towns don't need to advertise or recruit. They simply wait for people to become desperate enough to accept any solution, no matter how strange or unlikely it might seem. The tragic irony is that the very qualities that make us human, our capacity for hope, our need for connection, our ability to imagine better lives for ourselves, are being weaponized against us. The entity has learned to use our greatest strengths as our greatest weaknesses, turning our dreams into nightmares and our hopes into chains. So, what can we do with this knowledge? How do we protect ourselves and our communities from this type of predation? The answer lies in understanding that the real danger isn't supernatural, it's psychological. These towns succeed because they offer easy solutions to complex problems, instant gratification for deep-seated needs, and escape from the difficult work of building genuine communities and meaningful lives. The best defense against this type of predation is to address the underlying vulnerabilities it exploits. Building strong communities, creating genuine opportunities for connection and belonging, addressing economic inequality and social isolation. These efforts don't just improve quality of life, they make us less susceptible to the false promises of entities that feed on human desperation. But perhaps most importantly, we need to remember that there are no easy solutions to the fundamental challenges of human existence. The desire for escape, the longing for belonging, the need for purpose, these are struggles that define the human condition. They can't be solved by finding the right place or the right community or the right opportunity. They require ongoing effort, genuine connection with others, and the courage to face life's difficulties without seeking supernatural shortcuts. The mountains of Appalachia will continue to whisper their promises to those who are desperate enough to listen. But now that we understand what they're really offering, we can choose to seek our solutions elsewhere, in the difficult but rewarding work of building genuine communities, meaningful relationships, and authentic lives. The entity that created these towns feeds on human desperation, but it cannot survive in the face of genuine human connection and mutual support. The choice is ours. We can continue to seek easy solutions to complex problems, making ourselves vulnerable to predators that understand our weaknesses better than we do, or we can do the hard work of addressing the root causes of human